Good evening and welcome everybody to tonight's Queer Table Talk as part of our Omaha Table Talk series. My name is Dominic Green and I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the Programs and Faculty Manager at Inclusive Communities. Before we start tonight's conversation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Indigenous and Native people that most of us gather on tonight that belong to the Omaha, Ponca, Pawnee, Odo, and more recently the Santee Sioux and Winnebago Native people. Omaha Table Talk, or OTT as we call them, was initially recreated in Omaha in 2003 by the Social Justice Advisory Committee of Catholic Charities Omaha. And then more than a decade ago, Inclusive Communities acquired OTT and shifted to a larger public discussion over comfort food. Now, due to COVID-19 this year, we have shifted to holding these events over Zoom and have also partnered, we partnered recently with OutNebraska, and Abbi, if you want to talk about our partnership.
I would love to as soon as I get the unmute to work. Hi, everyone. I'm Abbi Swatsworth. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the executive director of OutNebraska, tonight's partner for Queer Table Talks. There will actually be 3 Queer Table Talks this coming season of the OTT season, and that is an opportunity for us to have conversations specifically around LGBTQIA2S+ communities and issues. And we really hope that you will enjoy these conversations and come back and bring friends. We are a statewide education and advocacy organization. And so this is just a part of the work that we're doing to educate the community. We're really happy to be here tonight. Thanks.
And thank you for your partnership. We really appreciate this. We do welcome you to have a snack or food or a beverage with you for tonight's discussion. Like I said, we usually have these conversations over comfort food, so feel free to have something close to you. We are also always looking to look at ways and find new ways to grow and get better. So at the end of tonight's conversation, we will be posting an evaluation link and would encourage you to fill that out for us so that we can learn and grow as we continue to hold these events. We'd like to thank our Omaha Table Talk sponsors, Lozier Foundation and Cox Communications, for providing that sponsorship and allowing for events like these to happen. Now I'm going to turn it over to Molly Welsh, who's going to chat about some housekeeping rules for tonight.
Hi, everyone. My name is Molly. I'm the Operations and Projects Manager for Inclusive Communities. I would like to remind everyone, you should have seen this when you registered. We are recording tonight's session and we put all of our Omaha Table Talks and Queer Table Talks up on the Inclusive Communities YouTube page. So you can not only tell your friends, but you can just send them a little link and they can hear it all too. We have some agreements as we build what we like to call brave space. We like to have difficult conversations over the comfort of your own Zoom. So in order to be able to do that, we have a couple of things to share and talk through. I'm sharing my PowerPoint that was scrolling with you earlier. And here are our virtual agreements. If you can, remain on camera as much as possible unless you don't want your image on the recording. That's totally understandable. That just helps us all. I love seeing people's faces over Zoom. We all see each other with masks and that's wonderful, but like to actually see all of your faces in these very trying times, I just love all of your faces. Thank you so much for being here. Remain on mute while others are speaking and presenting, but be ready to participate. We will have a breakout session, and I'll go over the timeline in just a second, but we will have some participation available to you. Remain engaged in the conversation. Avoid any distractions just for your own safety. I'm just going to put my phone over here. I'm going to close the door so the cats can't get in here. Whatever you need to do to minimize your distractions, go for it. Feel free to use the chat function if you have a question or a comment or a resource that you would like to share. I will be collecting all of the resources and sending out a follow-up email after the event, just so you don't have to furiously take notes. I'll do that for you, and I will send out something that shares all the resources that we've shared in that data sheet too. And all the reaction functions, you can give us a heart, you can raise your hand, you can do whatever you're comfortable with doing on Zoom. And we would like to ask that you rename yourself with your pronouns. We love normalizing pronouns. And if you need help doing that, throw it up in the chat and one of us can tell you how. I believe those are all the agreements I've got. The timeline. So the timeline for these QTTs are amazing because they always leave you wanting more. So I'm going to post the timeline in the chat. We're just welcoming you all right now, and we're a little behind schedule, but we're going to get back in there. We're going to have a panel discussion. After the panel discussion, we're going to go into breakout rooms where we have 4 volunteer facilitators with us today. Could you raise your physical hands, volunteers, so we can see you? And they have renamed themselves with facilitator at the beginning. Thank you so much for being here, y'all. Your facilitators will lead the breakout discussions, and we will all report back and come back for a full group discussion afterwards. We'll wrap up and do that evaluation. We've got the amazing, she knows it's coming, Pam Duncan here as our American Sign Language interpreter. If you would like Pam to be in your breakout room, shoot me a note in the chat and I will make sure that she follows you wherever you need her to go. And I think that's it. Back to you, Dominic, to get this all started, unless I forgot something, and then you'll pick it up for me.
That's all great. Thanks, Molly, and thanks again for everybody being here tonight. So let's jump into the conversation, and Abbi Swatsworth with OutNebraska will moderate tonight's panel conversation and introduce the panelists.
Terrific. So we have 3 amazing panelists this evening. I'm really pleased that they could join us, really have amazing stories and just great things to share, and we'll jump right in. We have Luke Peterson, Darryl Brown Jr., and Tommy Young Dennis are going to be our panelists this evening. We have a series of questions that we'll try to get through in our 30-minute time. So let's start with Darryl, and then Luke, and then Tommy. When do you remember first learning about HIV, and how would you characterize that education?
So for me, I think that the first time I remember HIV even being mentioned, particularly in the education space, was during sex ed, junior high. I went to private school all my life, and the conversation was very, actually a lot of the scare tactics that we hear the horror stories of, unfortunately, I was a victim of. It included pictures of individuals with sores on their bodies. It was slightly traumatizing, actually, initially when I first heard about the virus.
All right, well, thank you, Abbi, for your question. Like Darryl's first experience, mine was traumatizing as well. I was around probably 10 or 11. I was raised on a farm out in rural Nebraska, and I didn't know exactly what HIV was until I was attending confirmation classes after grade school. And one day, I think it was probably during the winter of that year, there was someone who had moved back into the hometown I was raised at. And the reason why everyone was talking about him is because he was the known community member that contracted HIV/AIDS. And that was the topic of the conversation that night at confirmation class. And everyone was talking about his name, and I was trying to figure out what his name was. And someone, I believe a mutual acquaintance of mine, nudged me to the side and said, we can't say his name because HIV is God's punishment for him. And that was the first instance that I realized this was something you don't want to have, something that isn't talked about, something that is undesirable.
Hi, everybody. So for me, I actually remember hearing about HIV pretty early on, but that was mostly because I had an aunt who did a lot of volunteer work. Specifically, I believe she volunteered with Charles Drew, as a matter of fact, passing out condoms to the community. But it was like through just like basic conversation with her that I first like learned about HIV, but then it wasn't really until like elementary or middle school when we really kind of got into it. And my experience wasn't too different from Daryl's actually. When we really started to dive into HIV and STIs really in general, there were a lot of scare tactics that were used. A lot of just like with pictures being shown to really just kind of, I don't know, just kind of scare you away from sexual encounters in general. I think that was I would like to think that was the goal. However, yeah, yeah, I think that was probably like the first instance that I really had an opportunity to learn about what HIV was, but really didn't understand like the nuance to it until I was, adult age, really.
So I really want to honor your stories, and a part of your story, something that I think people are interested in knowing, is whether you know how you acquired HIV. And we can start with Darryl again and just keep that rotation.
So cat's probably out of the bag in my case, that I do know how I transmitted it, wrote a whole book about it. Entitled "How I'm Positive I Forgive You, How I Forgave the Man That Gave Me HIV." I tell the story of how I navigated the diagnosis and arrived at a place of forgiveness concerning the person that transmitted the virus to me. The short and narrow of it is I got the virus having sex. I got the virus engaging in condomless sex with someone that was living with HIV themselves.
Well, I'm going to have to read Darryl's book now. Like his situation, I'm pretty sure I contracted HIV through unprotected sex as well. However, unlike that story is I don't know necessarily whom I contracted it from, because at the time I was fairly sexually active. It will be 11 years come this March that I've tested positive. And I'm really happy to hear that Darryl had forgiven the person who was maybe just not as forthright as they should have been. It's taken me a long time to get to that place for myself. So that makes me really happy to hear that for someone else.
Yeah, and I guess just to keep the ball rolling, similarly, that's how I contracted HIV, was through a partner who I thought was exclusive. Turned out that was not the case. And just to kind of like do like a add in to that, I had actually, before I was diagnosed, which has been almost 10 and a half years ago, I actually tested negative probably 4 months prior to my diagnosis. So just like, I really like to highlight that, because like literally within a matter of 4 months, like my health situation just kind of, I won't say like I was sick or anything like that. But it did, like the symptoms did start to manifest fairly quickly. Although I didn't know they were symptoms at the time.
Ditto,
So-
Tommy. Sorry, Abby.
Go ahead, Darryl.
I was tested in November, found out in February. The November test came back negative. February tests came back positive. So yeah, about that, the brevity of the change. Yeah, I can definitely stand in solidarity with that for sure.
So, what kind of language do you wish people would stop using when they're talking about HIV or people who are living with HIV?
I got a list. Infected. Makes me cringe to hear people say that people living with HIV are HIV infected. I just did today, in honor of World AIDS Day, I did some snippets via my own Facebook page to just highlight some things to reduce some stigma, to encourage testing, some different things. And that was one of the things that I brought up. Like, if you Google, take a minute to go on Google, go to the image section and Google infection. And then let me know if that's how you would like to be referred to. All of the pictures are gruesome. They're horrendous. They are traumatizing in some instances. And so to attach that to somebody's lived experience is damaging, to say the least. I mean, I could go on and on. Hearing people say that they have that package, hearing people say they got that shit, hearing people say without any medical knowledge of it being accurate that someone has AIDS as opposed to having HIV. Hearing people say that people living with HIV are sick. They're sick. That makes me sick to hear them say that they are sick, because in some instances, no shade, I may be healthier than some of the people that may be on this call that are not living with HIV. It is not an indication of me being sick by any means. I have a health condition, but by no means am I sick. So those are just a few things. I don't want to steal them all.
The word that probably really gets under my skin that people use and that I just hear about it all the time is if they ask you if you're clean. And it's like, what do you expect? I've taken a shower today. I just cleaned my place. Yeah, of course I'm clean. What are you talking about? And then bothers me the most is the insinuation that if you're not clean, you must be dirty. And then that I must be a dirty person because I live with HIV. That really bothers me a lot. Other language that gets under my skin is if we use binary terminology. Darryl mentioned a couple others. If you're sick, then you must be healthy, or what's another one? Just anything that makes the insinuation that you're less than desirable, that you're less than human. And that I don't actively listen to phrases like that, but when people say it, it's just like a dog whistle. It's just something that you notice right away, and it really shuts off a lot of feelings that I might have, and it just makes me put up the defense.
For me, really, like Darryl and Luke pretty much hit the nail right on top of the head. Anything that does not center me or use person first centered language is very problematic for me. But similar to like what Darryl said, the word infected really gets under my skin like none other. And just kind of like for the audience out there, just to kind of give you a little bit of history, this is something that has been attempted to be addressed over the last 40 years of the epidemic. I encourage anybody who's not familiar with it to look up the Denver Principles, because that was the purpose behind the Denver Principles, to use person first language when referring to people who are living with HIV. But yeah, words like infected, or even when people have the tendency to add the in front of HIV or AIDS. And this is coming from like my professional perspective. because I do, both myself and Darryl both work at the Nebraska AIDS Project. But AIDS is even becoming an antiquated term in terms of referring to people who are living with HIV, because it's really more of a clinical diagnosis than it is anything. Um, there's really nothing that changes outside of your CD4 count when it comes to HIV and AIDS. So, needlessly referring to someone as AIDS positive is completely unnecessary.
Anything else? Darryl, was there anything that got missed on your long list that you'd like to go back to? We're busting stigma. This is about busting stigma, so helping people understand.
I think another piece is the assumption that comes with an HIV diagnosis that leads people to the idea or the thought that someone must be same gender loving. Not that there's anything that is an issue with that. I am a same gender loving individual. So it's not about that. But what I say that to say that consistently throughout history and even present day, HIV is so readily associated with same gender loving folks, even dating back to the older name before HIV was called HIV, before it was called AIDS. We knew it was called GRID, the gay related immune disease. So it's like, we don't, there is this association, this negative association of the virus with homosexuality, of it being, like Luke brought up, of it being a punishment. I bring this up in one of our episodes. Tommy and I host on Sundays a show called Sunday Sex Talks, where we're uplifting these subjects around HIV. And shameless plug, every Sunday, 6 p.m. You can find it on my page, Tommy's page, or Nebraska AIDS Project's page. But I say all of that to say that we lift that conversation up, because when people say things like the down low, or oh, they must have been on the down low, not only do I find that to be problematic as far as sexual orientation goes and trying to shame someone's sexual orientation, I find it problematically from a racial standpoint, because racially speaking, whenever somebody says the down low, nobody is thinking of a cisgender white man. They are thinking of a Black same gender loving individual that is sleeping with both genders. And what is it about that makes that down low? What is it about that makes that any different than anybody else's circumstance that may identify as these more modern terms, pansexual or bisexual or things of that sort? So all of those things are problematic for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for adding that information, because I think it's really, as we start talking about language that's problematic, that people can learn how to speak on the topic in a more educated way and to be better about it. This is probably the last question we've got, and we're doing really well on time. So over the years, have you been concerned about transmitting HIV in your sexual partners?
I'm gonna jump the line on this one.
Go for it.
As you should. It's only right.
So that, because that's a loaded question, honestly, because I can honestly say up until maybe 2016, 2017, that was absolutely a real concern of mine. And part of that is because yes, you can go to your doctor's appointments. Yes, you can receive the undetectable diagnosis, but you don't know what happens in between. Like, you don't know what will cause your viral load to spike. You don't know when that CD4 count is going to drop. So that's always been a concern in the back of my mind. But then in 2017, when I actually received affirmation and confirmation that undetectable equals untransmittable, not to say that that made me relax any of the protective measures that I personally were taking in my, with partners, but it kind of lifted a burden of mine. if you will, because I knew as long as I would, as long as I was taking my medication, as long as I was doing what I was supposed to be doing, then the instance or the possibility of transmitting the virus to a partner was non-existent.
I got to piggyback on that one. Agreed. It was definitely an area of panic for me initially on, to the extent that it's interesting the journey that we go through with sexuality. It's like as a child, if you did not grow up in a sex positive household, you grew up with sex being this negative thing, this don't do it, that's bad, that's horrible, it's sinful, it's all of these things. And it doesn't become great until you are in, for some folks, this monogamous relationship that you then end up in a marriage and have the children. And then sex becomes beautiful. And then it's only beautiful to the extent that it produces children and it pleases you privately, but you're not supposed to talk about that publicly. It's a lot of weird, nuancy stuff to that. And it's like that journey, it was like revisiting that time frame of my life, of going back to the idea of sex no longer being a positive thing, of sex no longer being pleasurable, of sex no longer being something that gave me joy, because every encounter for me was me having to convince myself that I was not going to be the cause of someone else's demise health-wise. Mm-hmm. It caused me to feel like, oh my gosh, am I going to transmit this virus to someone that I love and cause them to have to live the rest of their life in the same manner in which I'm living mine? Because HIV, as controlled as we've got it now and as many steps forward as we have made, it is still a life-altering diagnosis. It is still a major change to the psyche and the physical body and a multitude of other aspects of our lives. And so it was an area of panic for me. And so like Tommy said, that U equals U thing, it was interesting because we had kind of arrived at that knowledge by, at least I had arrived at that knowledge by trial and error, by what we would call slip-ups. Those in the moment moments where it was like, okay, yeah, it happened and I disclosed. And even though I disclosed my status, we still engaged in condomless sex. And oh my gosh, what did we just do? And then to have been in relationships with individuals that were not living with HIV, and down the line after this multitude of slip-ups, because if we just be honest, condomless sex feels good. I think that's a conversation to have, that we would do well to say that and be honest about that. And like, yes, we advocate for barrier methods in sexual encounters, mm-hmm. but the reality is that it feels good to not have on a condom. And so after multiple slip-ups and the partner continuing to be tested and still not having contracted HIV, you arrive at this place of, maybe somebody's not telling us something. And then, so when the CDC came out with that campaign of U equals U, and let us know that someone that is undetectable, it cannot transmit the virus, it was life-changing for me, because I just wanted to just, for lack of a better word, I just wanted normal sex.
Well, I'm going to echo on that panic for the beginning, because I think that's a very valid and real concern. When you just tested positive, can you transmit it to someone else, and especially to someone that you love? That's a very palpable fear. But it took me until I was going to some medical procedures when I first tested positive, and it took a nurse to accidentally poke her glove when she was working on me, that convinced me I have to be on medication, because at the time I was wrestling back and forth. Do I take life-altering drugs or do I just die? Which was kind of the mindset at the time. But once I overcame that initial fear that you should take PrEP, and let's be clear, PrEP for me is not the same as PrEP for people who are HIV negative, because I have to take it every night for the rest of my life. And that's not the same as other people who do not have a positive status. But I think what's really, really important to underscore, and this is the addition that I want to add for both Darryl and Dennis, what they were talking about, is when you do become undetectable and you do have that confidence that you know you can't, because an undetectable status literally means you have to drain all your bodily fluids in order for you to risk transmission. And I don't know about you, but I'm not a vampire, and that's something I'm not really into. But that's just something that is medically very unlikely. But what is still likely is for you to get a second infection of another STD if you engage in unprotected sex. And taking PrEP doesn't stop from gonorrhea, doesn't stop from chlamydia, doesn't stop all of those. So that's something that you really have to be careful about in terms of trusting people, because you're trusting them more than just with the status, you're trusting them with your life.
What are things you wish I would have asked you? Is there another question that you feel we should have covered? Anyone that would want to jump in?
I think that the question about how can people that are not living with HIV be of benefit in this fight against the virus? And for me, I think a big part of that has to do with holding yourself to all of these standards that we've uplifted about language and things of that sort, having these open dialogues with your family members, providing medically accurate, comprehensive sexual health education to your children, to your family members, so that they are well aware of what is accurate and what is not. And I think, like, when you are in a space where you hear individuals utilizing stigmatizing and shaming language or medically inaccurate language, not always leaving that burden on someone that is living with HIV to be the one to speak up and to speak out, that it absolutely is a benefit to have allies that will support us in protecting our reputation, protecting how we are addressed and things of that sort. And so that's a major piece for me, and hopefully a takeaway that I pray sticks with folks.
Awesome. Did anybody else have anything? I think we're back on track in terms of time. So I just want to really thank each of you for your openness, for your willingness to share your stories and be a part of this panel. It really is important for folks to see the faces of people living healthy lives and being honest and sharing that part of yourself to break down stigma. And I just really appreciate you. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Abby, for moderating that conversation. So we are going to move into our breakout rooms at this point. But don't worry, if you do have questions for the panel and we have some time when we all come back to do a share out, we will have some time for some questions then. So hold on to those questions that you might have. Molly, can you share with us some of our norms or agreements before we go into these breakouts?
Yeah, we already talked through some agreements, but it is worth mentioning these breakout rooms are smaller groups, so it's an even braver space than the large group that we are in now. And we have a couple of additional agreements for these small groups. We've already introduced your wonderful facilitators. We do ask that you choose someone as a group to share out to the whole group when we come back. That could be your facilitator or it could be someone else, but you as a small group will make that determination of who volunteers as tribute. So for our agreements, we have one mouth, one mic. Y'all know what I'm talking about, just meaning we're not talking over each other or interrupting. we're being respectful, allowing someone to finish a thought, even if there's some silence in between. The Vegas twist. So we used to call it the Vegas rule, but we realized that the stories that you share in this brave space need to stay in the space, but the lessons that you learn can leave the space. So that's the Vegas twist. Make space, take space. If there's someone in your group that has a lot to say, that's wonderful. But just make sure that that person who maybe hasn't gotten a chance to speak gets to take up a little bit of space too. And the facilitators will help with that. Keep open minds. We all have different ideas. We were all raised with different programming. So be respectful of other people's perspectives and be respectful. That's all. So I'm going to open up rooms. We'll be in our rooms for about 20 minutes. And when we come back and share out, the main focus when we come back is our action items. And we'll pull our panelists in again one more time and just talk through. And we've already touched on some of these things. What can we do? What can we do? And I already have a list going, and I'll send out the list of action items in this follow-up email for y'all. But how can we go deeper than what we've already discussed?
Welcome back, everybody.
Right, I think we have everyone.
Yep.
What I'm gonna do is just read through each group and ask you all to take about a minute and share out some of the topics. We like to do just an abbreviated version of what you talked through so that we can jump right into the action items and more of a Q&A session with our panelists. So room 1, we had our facilitator, Brian, Hannah, and Mary. Who from your group is Tribute?
All right, I had to unmute myself. So we discussed, we followed the questions as I'm sure everyone else in their groups did. And we kind of talked about our growing awareness. All of us have gone to events or heard about things before this particular event, but it was still, I thought, really helpful, especially in terms of the useful language or, being cognizant of the language that you're choosing to use. We discussed that a little bit because I think that's something that's really easy to kind of ignore or to skip over and to not be using either people-centered language or just to kind of refer to people in an offhanded way without really taking into consideration their full humanity. We also discussed like our own kind of, I guess, first encounters with HIV and AIDS awareness when we're younger, and kind of reiterating that similar refrain of this is something to be avoided. This is something that's scary. This is something that someone has that you need to stay away from that person, kind of, and that kind of fear mongering, I guess, how dangerous that is and how unhelpful it is. And then we also talked about the steps that we are, that we can take in our own lives in terms of pushing back against people who maybe give out incorrect information or who would say something that is prejudicial. I work with a lot of students in after-school programming, and I have a 3-year-old son. And so I know that when I think about the ways in which I serve as like a resource to my students and as someone who's trying to mold my child into a certain kind of person, that I take away from a conversation like this information where I want to help educate and help be like a positive resource for them. So I think that's one way in terms of next steps. Obviously, there are a lot more. Hopefully another group will share some. But.
Thank you. Group 2, we had our facilitator, Denise, with Alyssa, Marley, and Matthew. Who from your group would like to share?
I was elected. I hope I do my group justice. We all felt that we learned a lot of important and critical information, that by learning it, it helps remove the fear, and we're hopeful with everything that we heard. And we just, like, it gave us new information to look up, and that, like the Denver principle, most of it hadn't heard that. So after this, we'll be Googling it. And it was really educational for us, and it brought us a lot of hope and uplifted us. So that's what we came with.
All right, group 3 with our facilitator, Lisa. We had Darla, Stephen, and Suzanne. Who would like to share from your group, Lisa?
I will. This is Lisa. And I had the best group ever. And I will say we just had a really rich discussion. And I think there was a lot of gratitude, like deep, deep gratitude for Luke and Tommy and Darryl for really sharing their stories and authentically. And that's like really personal information, and we're just really grateful. There was lots of learnings or conversations about what is PrEP. What is that? Also, a lot of conversation around just thinking about the last couple of decades. I think the last 25 years, it's just so different from what it was like in the early 90s. I think when I was going out of high school, and I think other people are probably in a somewhat similar age group, well-seasoned professionals. But it was, very different in terms of conversations around it. And I think we're still living in that culture of shame and silence, but it was certainly not what it was like in the 90s. Really resonated with Darryl, especially Darryl's conversations around how language matters, right? Language constructs thoughts, words matter. And had no clue, like some of us talked about not having any sort of understanding around how the down low term can be so racialized, and that can be so harmful. So I think that was really impactful. And then I think, again, we kept going back to just how do we continue to reduce the shame and stigma, probably in our everyday conversations, and of course, advocate for comprehensive sex ed. So I know that was already mentioned, but that's also my jam. So we'll definitely always mention that. And that how young people need adults who will listen. So how do we have those conversations with young people in open, honest, brave, complex ways, and not just give them platitudes, right? Like just say no did not work for drugs, and it's definitely not going to work for sex and all that. And then for advocacy, we really are looking for new ways to be involved. Saddened that we can't have Night of 1,000 Stars, and we want to definitely support NAP. Are there other fundraisers? Are there other things that NAP's doing that we can really support? And then, of course, also we are also working with the Nebraska Department of Ed on brand new health standards with a vote in September of 2021. So I've got all the things on. I think a public comment hearing will be in February. So if folks want to connect with the Women's Fund, talk to me about sex ed advocacy, because that's a big part of reducing the shame and stigma around HIV and STIs and all of that.
Thank you. If you'd like to share any links on that, Lisa, I'll include them. And then group 4, we had our facilitator, Emily, with Deb, Jennifer, Laura, and Mary Barton. Who from group 4 would like to share out?
I didn't realize I could unmute myself. Facilitator fail. Yeah, so we had the best group, Lisa. Sorry to break it to you. It was also clear that we were all supposed to be in the same group because our interests and our research and our experiences were all very, very similar and unique. And we had Jennifer. I don't know if she was in your list. We had a late addition to our group who we also adore. But yeah, the first thing that we primarily talked about was just reminders about language and how important it is. That's something that all of us have studied in some way, shape, or form, but a reminder that saying one thing implicitly references the other, and that keeping that in mind, that when we're talking about language, you want to make sure that you're not accidentally implying something you don't want to, and being mindful of language that is supportive of everyone. And ultimately, when we were talking about longer term, removing the stigma, decoupling the stigma from the person and the diagnosis, that we were hoping that we could push it in a direction where it would just be another of the chronic illnesses that we deal with, where we can take out that piece that is shameful, that is, something you're not supposed to talk about. And that while we have made some progress in moving in that direction, that we still have a long ways to go. and that it is important for those of us who aren't necessarily living with that diagnosis to step up and take that onus. Yeah, ultimately, big thanks and for Luke and Tommy and Darryl and sharing their stories so openly. We really appreciated that, and it really came back to language and how we could better support everyone in our choices of language and be mindful of the language of others, and as we go into the world pushing our advocacy and helping to uplift people and get them all on our page.
Well, thanks everybody for sharing out and sharing out what y'all discuss in your groups. We do have some time for some questions to the panel, and I know a couple of our panelists need to leave here shortly. So if anybody would have a question for our panelists, and we can take some time now. You can just go ahead and unmute yourself and go for it.
I have a question just about family and supportive families, and whether or not you created a chosen family because your family of origin was not supportive or helpful or welcoming, and just kind of what that road's been like.
Yeah, I can go. So from the time that I was diagnosed, my family has been nothing but supportive. As a matter of fact, I had an aunt who, just kind of like in an act of solidarity, once I disclosed my status to her, which I disclosed the same day, she walked up to me and she kissed me right on the lips, just to kind of show that her fear was non-existent and that nothing had changed about me in her eyes, and that she was willing to just support me, and she did it in so many ways. Before she passed, she actually fronted the cost for my first round of medication. And this was before I had the opportunity to get on any kind of assistance through the Nebraska AIDS Project. HIV medications are not cheap. And even with insurance, my first prescription ran me about $210. And she was just like, "Here, take it." But she was my rock before she passed. But I in addition to that, I am so glad that I've had the opportunity to also have a chosen family who has supported me along the way, and really just kind of helped develop me and really grow me, because before I became so open with my status, it was just kind of like one of those things where it was just like, okay, well, I guess I'll share my story, but if nobody really like wants to hear my story, then I'm okay. But like, I've had like a chosen family who was kind of like, pushed me to like be the best version of me possible. And Darryl is actually one of those people, who has just like kind of helped elevate me to where I'm at now.
Okay. I see what we're doing here. Okay. Trying to get, all right. I see what's happening here. Similarly, I have had support both in my biological family, as well as I have had the privilege of having a chosen family as well that has supported me along the way. I will say that my journey is slightly different though, whereas Tommy disclosed to particular family members immediately. I didn't disclose to my family until 6 to 8 months later. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, is my mother had just suffered 2 strokes at the time. And I was very fearful about what the news would do to her health-wise. And I also didn't trust not another one of my family members to hold the information without it getting to her. So I held on to that news until October of the year that I was diagnosed. And we did something very unconventional that I look forward to trying to hopefully model again in the days to come. in my role at NAP is that we provided literally a family education space where we literally came together as an entire family. I cooked, and we literally covered HIV 101 and allowed them to ask any questions that they had during that time. And from that point on, I've had nothing but support. Actually, because I'm the inappropriate guy in the family, I actually probably joke about my status more often than my family is comfortable with me doing. But that's just who and how I am. And so it is what it is. But I appreciate all of the support that I have received from Tommy as well, because Tommy was diagnosed 3 years prior to myself. He tried me, so he deserves this. Tommy was diagnosed 3 years prior to myself. And interestingly, the very exact words that I mouthed to him when he shared his status with me, he was able to mouth those words back to me as one of the first individuals to know about my status while I was still hospitalized. And his support literally has me in the position that I am in right now, to share my story, to work in the field, and to do what I do openly and honestly. So there's that. Payback. Boop.
Well, for I guess my experience is similar in the way that I didn't tell my family probably 3 to 4 months after I was first tested positive. And because I was deeply ashamed, I was shutting myself down with my friends, my neighbors, my family. It got to the point where I was ignoring my parents' calls. And my mom at the time dispatched my sister because she was the only one that I would answer the phone call for. And my sister, when I finally told her, was living in Chicago at the time. She immediately got off the phone, told her boss that she's taking vacation time, and she came to Lincoln to take care of me for a week. And that was my sister's experience. But when I told one of my brothers, and we're good now, but when I told one of my brothers about my status, his question to me was it worth it? Was the night that you had worth the lifetime that you're going to have? And I was so angry at him that I stopped talking to him for probably, I think, 3 years. We finally actually have learned to let go of those feelings. But the biggest impact that I remember with my family was when my first trip to UNMC 10 years ago. And that was with both my parents. And we were, all three of us, just so nervous, so timid, just like wandering out in the woods because we had no idea what we were doing, what we were going to. And all three of us were just trying to put on this brave face in this clinic in Omaha. And finally, when the doctor called me back to do the visit, my mom just breaks down because she just can't have it anymore. And the doctor just took my mom's hand, looked at her, and said, "I'm going to take care of your son because that's what I do here. I take care of people's sons." And all of us in the room just started to cry, and it was a moment. And that's something that I wish, I can share with my mom again. She's no longer here, but that's something that I do remember.
Deb, killer question. That was good. Thank you for asking that.
So I'm going to jump in here. So a few of us, while you all were in breakout rooms, were talking about how COVID has affected medication and this community. So if you all could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great, because I don't think everybody really realizes how COVID affects everything.
Yeah, so I can actually speak for, and I'll openly share the fact that I had COVID. So I actually was diagnosed with COVID back in early August. Um, One thing I will say is that I'm fortunate enough to have not only a doctor um, that I've actually been seeing for the duration of my diagnosis, that consistently has a team of nurses that checks in on me. um, but what I will say in terms of like medication is that I've never had a lapse in my medication, especially during a time of COVID. But what I will say is that I have noticed like there's almost like a sense of urgency when it comes to people who are living with HIV, because it's really been like almost rapid fire. Like before, like 3 weeks before my medication gets ready to run out, my pharmacy is calling me, trying to get me to refill, and if I don't refill, then it's kind of like a panic effect, if you will, to where like there's countless voice messages, countless you know, yeah, really just countless attempts to communicate in an effort to prevent me from having that lapse in medication, or in just like my overall care in general.
I'll say COVID has just made care scarier, if I can say it that way. It has lifted the anxiety level. Um, there was already a level of angst that was present going to your regular checkups, and now just and not that it is without reason, but just the additional screening and all of the precautions that are taken, it feels really post late 80s. That it really is an interesting dynamic, and is almost damn near scary to go to the doctor in a lot of ways. And you understand that they're taking all of the precautions that they can to ensure that everyone's staff and clients are safe. But it is alarming sometimes to walk through the door and to go through all that you have to go through, just to be seen. So that's the only way in which I have seen COVID affects, in addition to, I guess I could also say, the fear factor of debating with oneself about, okay, is the fact that my CD4 count at a good number, is that sufficient enough to not make me more readily susceptible to the virus, to coronavirus? Those are just thoughts that run through my own head. I don't know how many other people living with HIV have similar thoughts, but it makes me extra cautious in particular environments, because I feel more at risk, for lack of a better term. And it is not even that there is science behind that statement, to be honest. It truly is just a thing.
And I'll also add to that, like for me personally, there's actually a level of trepidation, because even though I was fortunate enough to recover from COVID, there's still like this unknown to, of knowing what COVID did to me. Um, and I'll be like fully transparent. Like I'll see my infectious disease doctor actually this coming Friday. So I'll really get a scope of kind of like where I stand. But it's frightening, because for so long I fought, like I changed, lifestyle habits just in efforts to try to get my CD4 count and my viral load decreased. So, being honest, like I'm scared to like actually go to the doctor on Friday, and out of fear of that I'm going to get an adverse, report that, my health, something has changed within my health over the last 4 months.
I'm glad I'm glad Tommy shared that because in the beginning with this pandemic, I was calling my doctor almost every day. But fortunately, I had seen him at least twice because the one time it was routine in the beginning of the pandemic, he was just testing me for rectal cancer, just out of the blue, wanted me to go get tested for rectal cancer. And he called me after that test came back and said, hey, you might have rectal cancer and this is a pandemic. So you might have to make some decisions here. And I was really overwhelmed in the beginning because I had no idea. I was struggling with myself and with how to navigate just trying to maintain my safety and just trying to deal with the fact that I might have cancer. And finally it came to the day where I saw the specialist, and I had to have two tests. I should have disclosed that in the first. There was the preliminary test, and then there was the confirmatory test. And the preliminary test came back positive, and the confirmatory test was how severe the kind of cancer that you have. Fortunately, it was not very severe for me, but this was still March, April, May of what we just been through. And I was going to Omaha because that's where my doctor is in Omaha. And it was 2-3 times a month, and my insurance bills came through, and I know exactly how much I owe. And the other thing that has been impacted is I get my prescription mailed to me, and that's something that I've chosen to do, but I have to do that early in advance, so then I know my prescription comes on time. And hopefully with the vaccine coming too, that will bring some relief. My doctor had told me that I might be in line for the first phase for the vaccine. We'll see. So I'm following that news really close.
Well, thank you, Luke and Tommy and Darryl, for sharing with us and being so vulnerable to share your stories and talking with us tonight. And thank you, Abbi and OutNebraska, for being our partners on this really, really awesome talk. Molly has just shared out our evaluation link, and so if you click on that, you're going to see the evaluation, and I'm trying to, it's not wanting to do it.
As Dominic pulls that up, we had a really long, great conversation about evaluations today, and
thank you.
How events like this, we're talking about COVID. This is the first time we've done virtual table talks, and I'm curious for everyone here, has anybody been to one of our in-person table talks? Just like show of hands, or virtual hands, however. And then, is this anybody's first virtual table talk with us tonight? Cool. Okay. Yeah, our survey, we've kind of included some, just like, what is this like? Like, what are we doing here? We're interested to see what that difference is and like what works well for both. And we're always trying to make our programs better at Inclusive Communities. That's just who we are. So we really appreciate your feedback.
Yes. Sorry, Molly, I was trying to figure out how to share my screen.
You did it for a second.
I did. So the screen that I shared, that's what the evaluation looks like. Please, we do value all the feedback that we get. So thank you again to Luke and Tommy and Darryl. I would like to promote our next Omaha Table Talk is January 12th. It will be at 6 p.m. and it will be on the conversation of poverty and living wage. Registrations are live for that. And our next QTT, Queer Table Talk with OutNebraska, is on Trans Day of Visibility, and that is March, I just had it, March
March 30th.
30th. Thank you.
And the
Christy.
link, the registration links for both of those events are in the chat.
And we'll include those in the follow-up email as well. Have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.